Hi, my name is Bob. I'm one of the pastors here at the meeting place. Hi. Listen, I want to start by saying this. Hildy and I have just recently returned from a sabbatical, so we've been away for a while, and it is just so good to be with you. It is so good to be back in this community that we love so very much, to be with people that we know and that we enjoy. And so thank you for the many of you that have offered words of kindness to welcome us back. Like, we are just thrilled to be here with you. This summer, we have been in a series that essentially has invited us into exploring the stories that Jesus told. Stories that we describe as parables. These are stories that Jesus tells for the purposes of introducing a significant truth. Often, the truth is contained in that moment in the story where there's a switch, where there's an unexpected turn. And today's story is no different. It is a story that has an unexpected turn. And so here is the story. Jesus continued. A few weeks ago, Carolyn was up on stage and she shared with us some reflections on two lost stories that dealt with a coin and sheep. Today it's a continuation of this lost theme. So Jesus continues. There was a man who had two sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing, so he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. 'Your brother has come,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf because he was has him back safe and sound.' The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him, but he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders, yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him.'" Here's our story. When you and I go to the movies, we watch a story unfold on the screen. In order to carry forward the story and the theme of the story, to tell the story, there are actors who've embraced the role of specific characters. And as we're sitting in this movie theater watching the story unfold on the screen, it is very likely that you and I will identify with one or perhaps more than one of the characters that's in the story. You can always tell when this happens because you actually begin to care for them. You begin to imagine that they're real people. They're experiencing the reality of what is presented to you. And you start wondering about the outcome. You start worrying about them. You start wanting things to happen in a certain way. If you don't resonate with any of the characters, you will leave that movie theater and you will turn to your friends and your family and say, "Don't waste your time going to that movie. It was useless." If you, however, go to the movie and you've identified with one of the characters to such a degree that you really begin to care about the story, you will talk about it in great terms. You'll say to people, "You absolutely must see this movie," because it will move you in perhaps unexpected ways. Jesus, is the master storyteller. He knows that in order to tell some of the truths that he's so desperate to pass on, he's going to have to make a connection with his audience. Often when we're reading our Bibles, the best way to understand what's actually going on is if we in fact imagine ourselves in that particular moment with the original audience. What were the first people that ever heard this particular story? What were they thinking? How were they processing this? And this is the process I want to invite you into. So Jesus begins to tell the story, which is a common practice. He starts talking about this father with his two sons and the outrageousness of the younger son, who really isn't actually that entitled to have a claim on the inheritance of his father anyways. This younger son goes to his father one day and says, "Listen, I can't wait for you to die. It's taken too long. Will you just hurry up? But since you're not following those particular wishes of mine, I want my inheritance now." So the father offers this. In fact, calls his two sons together and divides up the inheritance, gives both of them their portion. Now I can tell you, the audience of the day, they're listening to the story that Jesus is telling, and they're offended right from the get-go. They can't believe Jesus would tell such a story. In fact, the fathers in the audience are looking at their sons and say, "Don't you get any ideas?" Right? They're troubled by this because, what is with this audacious young son? What was he thinking? How could he be so disrespectful in a culture where the fathers were considered to be these authority figures, these benevolent, kind rulers in their homes? And this son was just so disrespectful. What was he thinking? But worse yet, the father doesn't take a strong stand. He doesn't say to his younger son, "You're out of your mind, go back to your room." He actually gives in and makes this arrangement, and in fact offers this inheritance to this younger son. So the audience is listening to this. They can't even believe this story. And then, worse yet, this young son decides to take all of the things that have been entrusted to him, and he leaves his home. He's going to go and do something with it. And what does he do with it? He goes off into some distant land and spends this money recklessly. This is getting worse all the time. It'd been so much more redeeming if this younger son had taken this inheritance, invested it in a startup company, and was now delivering goods by drone all around the world. Right? His father would have been impressed, would have said, "You've made something of this." But no, this young son just squanders it. Can you imagine being part of that original audience? They're listening to this and thinking, what kind of ridiculous story is this? Is this ever going to end? And it gets worse. Because this younger son, obviously, as you and I would totally imagine would happen, runs out of resources. He runs out of the wealth that's been entrusted to him. It's all gone. So he's got to look for a job. And can you believe it? Of all the jobs that may have been available to him, he chooses to work for a hog farmer. Pigs in their culture were not seen as clean animals. It was a violation of so many things that were sacred to them. The audience, by now, there's murmuring going on. There's about to be a revolt because they can't even believe that Jesus is sharing such a ridiculous story. It gets even worse. This young son, he's breaking all the rules. But one day, he's actually watching the pigs eat the slop at the trough, and he's thinking to himself, these pigs are eating better than I am. What am I going to do? Oh, I have an idea. I'll go back to my father. Can you imagine the audience? They're thinking, are you out of your mind? Do you think you're going to be respected and appreciated by your father? Do you think he's going to have room for you? In the meantime, the way you've behaved, he's written you off. He wants to forget about the fact that you even exist. And you imagine you're going to go home and receive anything from him? This is a ridiculous thing. But Jesus tells the story. And this young man does, in fact, head home. He goes back home because he's going to, turn to the only place he can turn to. And something interesting happens. I love this line. There's this verse that says, "And while he was still far off, the Father saw him." You see, Jesus now describes the Father, and of course, when he's telling parables, his main aim probably consistently is to try to help the audience understand the true nature of God. So this instance, he's describing the Father in the terms that really describe it the way Jesus knew his Father to be. Because this Father is not a father who just simply went inside his house and closed his door and said, I write off this young son of mine, I'm going to forget that he ever existed, but rather this notion that while he was still far off, the father saw the son. It just leaves me with the impression that this father left his home. Perhaps every day he walked down the very road that the young son had left on to leave home. He walked down that very road, perhaps got to the next important intersection, and stood there looking every which way longingly, hoping that one day he would see his son on the distant horizon. And sure enough, there's that one day, and it happens. And again, the audience is even more offended by now because they can't believe the way this father is being described. What do you mean he would leave his home to go and pursue his son? His son doesn't deserve that kind of treatment. What father would show that kind of weakness? This is ridiculous. This is not the way it should be. That son made a mistake. He made a terrible mistake, and he should suffer the consequences. That the father should now, with all that's happened, go out of his way to do more, to extend love to his son. What is this story? The young son is no good. The father is a disappointment. How is this story ever going to have a turn for the better? The father takes the son home, gives him a fresh set of clothes, puts a ring on his finger, gives him some sandals, and decides to slaughter the fattened calf and have a Brazilian barbecue. Can you imagine? The audience is listening in. They don't like this. They don't like what's happening at all. And to their great joy, another character is introduced. The big brother, the older brother, shows up. He's been out in the fields. He's been so busy doing the responsible thing, he's missed the beginning of the party. He comes near the house, and there's dancing going on. There's music pumping. He's thinking to himself, what's going on? What's happening here? What's the occasion? And one of the servants comes out and informs him, and so he says, well, you better send my dad out. The audience is now listening because they're thinking, great, because this son, he's going to straighten things out. He's the mature one. He's the wise one. He's the responsible one. He's going to say it how it is. And the father comes out, and the son says to him, the older brother says to him, what's with this? What are you doing? I have been here all along. I didn't leave home. I took this inheritance that you entrusted to me, and I stayed home with it. In fact, we've been working together and having this partnership. I've been responsible. I've worked for you like a slave. I've never asked for anything. I've really just done everything that you would expect me to. And this son of yours, this young kid who went off and wasted his money, probably on prostitutes, has come home and you throw a party for him? What are you thinking? You don't understand us millennials at all. I'm going to inform you of what's true here. This young son doesn't deserve this stuff. And the father turns to him and listens to all that he has to say. And he's deeply saddened. But the audience, in the moment, believes that the older brother is the hero of the story. He has just corrected the wrong. He has just said what is true and what is right. He has just established what the rules of reference are about this relationship, about this story, how it unfolded. The audience is satisfied that the right person has been introduced to redeem the story. So that leaves the story in our hands for now. What are you and I going to do with the story? And I'll tell you how I engage this. Every time I read this story, I have to be honest with you, and perhaps this is true of you also, but I don't want to offer this. I want to offer this as a thought for you, but I don't want to make this declaration. But here's the thing. As much as I'm a father, so I understand a father's heart, and I can identify with that part of it. And as much as my history also includes a time when I behaved like a younger son and ran away from things and only returned when I was in desperate circumstances, as much as those things are true, at the end of the day, do you know who the character is I most identify with? It's the older brother. I am the older brother. I have a strong sense of right and wrong. Perhaps you do too. I see my entire world through the lens of this setup, this particular perspective. I'm just aware of it. I understand his argument. I understand his disappointment. I understand the things that he says about his younger brother. I understand the older brother perfectly, and perhaps you do also. So why is that? Well, a few weeks ago, Carolyn was up here on stage, and she was talking about the lost coin and the lost sheep, and I was sitting in the rows, and I was listening to what she was saying, and then she referenced the idea that there are amongst humanity the people who are privileged, who have advantages, who have perhaps access to things that are not available to everyone. And she started describing what these people are like. And as I was listening to her list of names, like I had to check all the boxes. Male, white, straight, amongst other things that she said. And I sat and listened to this and I thought, I am in fact a privileged person. I had advantages that perhaps I didn't choose. Like the older brother, he didn't know he was going to be the older brother. He didn't plan to become the older brother. He was born to the circumstances. There are some things that are true of me that I didn't arrange. They became available to me, but they're not available to just anyone. And so I want to veer off and tell you another story of a part of my life that has actually dramatically affected my perspective. So during our sabbatical, Hildy and I were able to experience a number of different adventures. Some of the things I will share over the coming weeks and months as I will have other opportunity to. But I want to just share a brief insight or a glimpse into part of our life for the time that we were away. I arrived here. I wasn't familiar with what the setup was going to be for the summer series and looked at the stage and I saw a tent and a little fire set up and some firewood, and I saw the trees behind and some of the gear in the campsite and the stars, twinkling above. And this is a scene that I see every year without fail. However, it became apparent to me very quickly that there was something missing. You see, whenever I see these kinds of things, I also see a canoe pulled up on the shore. And so I decided to add a little something this morning. But this isn't just something average. This is a birch bark canoe. Hildy and I built it. We spent 33 days away from our home in the woods of Ontario, living with an incredible artist, a man named Tom, who has made it his life's mission to learn how to do this. He's been doing this for 25 years. This is canoe number 91. And what is even more ridiculous about this canoe is that we went into the woods every day and we collected the materials that we needed to build it. None of this comes from Home Depot. So let me share a few pictures with you, because here is the thing. This building of this canoe, as we were away from home, changed our perspective. It brought us into a world that was entirely unfamiliar to us. So let me just give you a few glimpses of this canoe. So first of all, we start with the bark. The picture is a little dark, but what you see is some bark that's been laid out on the working table. It's weighed down by a temporary building frame with a bunch of rocks that keep it in place. I had a deeply emotional experience. We were in the woods with a ladder leaned up against a paper birch tree or a canoe birch tree, and Tom was working on releasing some of the bark that is featured on this canoe, and I was standing at the base of this thing, and suddenly I was overwhelmed by what I was witnessing. Now, I'd known about birch bark canoes for a long time, so that wasn't the surprise. But the thing what happened is I was almost like transported in time to thousands of years ago when that first man or that first woman stepped up to a paper birch tree and perhaps looked at the bark and decided there was something that could be done and took off that first piece and looked at this material and thought, I could make a container out of this. I could do something with this. And I'm not sure how much time passed before somebody had the idea that maybe it could be used to build a vessel like this that would allow people to pass across lakes or rivers, whatever they needed to transport like all kinds of goods and people in. But I was moved by this notion that I was involved in a project that reflected in some ways the incredible history of this country and in some ways put me in touch with the people who've gone before. This canoe features some structural elements that by now are hidden inside all these roots that we use to stitch this thing together. Do you know where these roots come from? They come from the grounds. They are the roots of jack pine trees. Hildy and I went out and we dug them out of the grounds. We dug out about 300 linear feet of roots. Then we had to take this root and boil it. Then we had to peel it. Then we had to split it. And then we had to take a crooked knife and we had to shape it so that it could be used for stitching. As we reviewed Hildy's diary, we spent a total of 7 days stitching, sewing bark together on this canoe. And of course, this canoe is an Eastern Ojibwe long-nosed canoe. And as soon as I declared that this is the canoe that I wanted us to build, this look in particular is the look that I think a canoe should have, and I'm disappointed my other canoe doesn't have this feature. As soon as I picked this, Tom informed us that it would mean continuous sewing all the way along the gunnel. It would mean a continuous seam between the bottom panel of the bark and the side panels. 7 days worth of stitching. Not all in a row, but over time. This canoe features on the inside cedar sheathing, which is the lining of the bark. And it features cedar ribs. Do you know where they come from? Wait for it. Dramatic moments. We're moving on. There. We cut down a cedar tree. We cut down 2 cedar trees. And then we started splitting the cedar. We split it and 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 we split it into smaller and smaller pieces until we either had material that was of the right thickness for cedar ribs that we can then carve with a hand-drawn knife to bring them down to the right thickness, or perhaps thin enough to create the sheathing, which is the lining of this canoe. If you look at that sheathing, if you look at it carefully, you'll notice there isn't a tool mark on it. Because the tool mark is on the other side, because when you split cedar, what happens is, when you finally get to that stage where it's thin enough where you're literally pulling it apart by hands, the cedar that comes off of this board has a smooth surface, and the other side you work down with a draw knife to get to the thickness that you need to line the inside of this canoe. I was overwhelmed by the incredible truth of what God has assembled in the woods that we live in to allow us to assemble something like this. There's a cap rail that rests on top of this canoe just to protect the roots as you're using it on a regular basis. And then finally, we get to an interesting finishing touch, which is the side of this canoe. If you look at it carefully, it's glossy in the lights. This is spruce gum mixed with bear fat to seal this particular seam so that it's waterproof. Where do you get spruce gum from? From spruce trees. We went through acres and acres and acres and acres, endless days of walking through the forest. And when you saw a tree, you'd walk up to it, and then you'd have to walk all the way around the perimeter of the tree to see if there was a place where perhaps a branch had broken off, or there was a gap in the bark, or for whatever reason the tree decided to leak some sap, and then we would collect it in small more portions. Hildy spent the first hour, the first day we did this, and after an hour she had less than a teaspoon of sap that she'd collected. Days and days and days of going around to collect a little pocket of sap. This is one of the bigger ones, by the way. That was about the size of a tablespoon, which was like an incredible find. I never thought that I would grow appreciation for this stuff. Normally it sticks on you and then you don't know what to do with it. Anyways, this is an incredible thing that happened, my friends. And while this was going on, we were entirely out of our comfort zone. There was nothing about the privilege of anything that I brought with me that gave me the opportunity to be about this thing. Not one thing. There wasn't a thing. There were no skills that we had ever developed beforehand that we could apply. In our work, we go to work and we have skills over years that we've developed that give us the possibility to succeed in what we're about. We weren't the ones to create the to-do list. Tom was entirely in charge of what was going to happen, when, and what day. And it was weather dependent. It was dependent on a number of factors that were entirely out of our control. We had no say. We did not live in our comfortable home. We didn't sleep in our preferred bed. We didn't use appliances that we have at home. In fact, there was nothing about this experience that in any way that we felt that we were prepared for, that we had anticipated. We were entirely in something different. We felt like we were in a different country. We were in a different culture. We were in a different environment altogether. And all we had was each other and God. We didn't have our friends. We didn't have our community. We didn't bring all of you with us. We didn't have our family. We didn't get to hug our grandchildren. We were away for 33 days. And while it was going on, there were days, many days, where we turned to each other and said, we're changing. This is changing our perspective. This is changing the way we view our world, because we're in circumstances that demand something new from us. How are we going to maintain this change when we return home? How are we going to allow this change to be a permanent one as opposed to just a temporary one, and we'll slip right back into familiar patterns? And this is where I will say, looking at the story today of the big brother in particular, who I resonate with, I'm confronted by the truth that there are perspectives that I hold, there are convictions that I hold, there are ways in which I see my world, there are behaviors that I've embraced that all relate to the big brother, that all connect me to this character of the big brother. And surely of that first audience, he was clearly the hero of the story. But I know something doesn't sit right. I don't think he is the hero. There's something wrong with this picture. There's something wrong with my convictions about the things that I stand for that, in fact, perhaps are a reflection of the privilege that I can't even name or point at in my life because it's so familiar to me. It's like the wallpaper in my life. I don't even know it, and yet at the same time, is it possible that my privileged position perhaps is to a disadvantage of someone else, and I'm not even sure. I'm not even aware of it. I've been withholding a verse of the story, not to mislead you, but just to give you this particular truth. Here's the verse. At the very end of the story, this is what Jesus says. "My son," the father said, "you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." This is an incredibly powerful part of the story that Jesus tells. He speaks now about the father's response to the big brother. And it's not about, "Big brother, I'm so grateful that you came to tell me the truth. I'm so grateful that you helped me to see what was actually going on. I'm so grateful that you didn't allow me to make this terrible mistake to honor your younger brother in this way. It's clearly inappropriate." No, none of that happened. What happened is the father turns to the older brother and says, "Listen, there's some things about my heart that you need to understand." And this is where I'm confronted by the simple truth. Where do I leave the comfort of my home? Where do I walk down the roads of the people who are far from home, who are longing to find a connection? Where am I longingly looking at their horizon line to find that next person who is looking for an answer, who is looking to be loved, who is looking to belong, who is looking to be received with love? Where are those people in my life? Where am I making room for that? And then look at this verse. Notice this incredible thing. The older brother believes that the party is actually happening at his expense. It's not true. The father says, "This is on my dime. Nothing of what's happening to honor your younger brother is at your expense. Everything I have is yours. I am with you always." Do I live in that kind of generosity? Do I live with a constant awareness of the very heartbeat of God that says in every given moment that I reflect what He would demand of me, that He would see as the generosity of this life as opposed to the scarcity that I'm often limited by? Here's the thing. This teach, if you look at the glance, is called the prodigal God, the prodigal father, not the prodigal son. What does prodigal mean? Spending resources freely and recklessly, wastefully extravagant. Yes, the younger son did that certainly on his little journey away from home, but the father is outdoing him with his reckless extravagance. He is showering upon him the things that in some ways he doesn't deserve. In many ways he should have not had access to this, and yet God showers this upon him. Do you and I live? Do I live with the perspective that God's warehouses are fully stocked and He will never run out? That I become generous beyond all measure? And then finally, notice the change in the language. In verse 24, when the father speaks about this younger son, he calls him my son. In this instance, he says to the brother, "Because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again, he was lost and is found. Be aware, he is your brother." The father is helping the older brother to understand that he has a responsibility of relationship. There's something that's apart from a father-son relationship. This is now a brother-to-brother relationship. In what ways am I seeing my world? Not only through the lens of God's compassionate presence, but in what ways am I seeing my world through eyes that allow me to be a brother to somebody, to be somebody who takes responsibility for the people around me? In what ways am I shaping my life according to that? You know what I love most about the story? If you've ever heard the story before, it's very likely that you have walked away, because I certainly have, walked away from the story believing that in fact it turned out bad. The brother never did join the party. In fact, he went sulking in the fields and waited until the music stopped, snuck into the house after the dad and his younger brother had gone to bed, went down to the fridge, made himself a ham and cheddar sandwich, and sat down at the kitchen table and contemplated how he was going to have breakfast in the morning with this younger brother that was going to show up and be at the family table again. That would be one outcome. The other outcome is possible, though, because the text doesn't tell us. Jesus doesn't finish the story. But is it possible that this older brother was compelled by the words of his father and said, you know what, I've misunderstood. And he joined the party, but before he did, he went to his room and got dressed properly for the occasion. Perhaps he found a knickknack on the shelf that he was going to present. At some point during the party, he said, could the music please stop? I have something to say. Younger brother, I'd written you off. I didn't think I'd ever see you again. I am so excited that you're here. Here's a gift that I want to offer to you to mark this occasion. Welcome home. I'm so looking forward to do life together with you again. My friends, I think I'm an older brother. Perhaps you think you're an older brother. What will it take for us to be persuaded, to honor and understand our Father's heart, to suspend the things that define us and rather to embrace a Father who has inspired these words at the meeting place for us to reorder our lives for the compassionate cause of Jesus in our friendships, our city, and our world. That's the invitation to you and I.
So I haven't even looked at them all yet. But I'll ask you one that I did look at, and then I'll scan what else has come in. I am the pained parent waiting for return, but it never comes. I am also dreading it if it happens. Sorry. What if I never get the chance and there's no reconciliation?
Thanks for those tears, John. Now I'm in tears. No, first of all, your pain is so real. I think if we spend a moment, we can think of people who we know could experience such incredible love and such incredible care, and yet because of life circumstances, there are these kinds of broken relationships that remain in place. So our heart goes out to you to share with you that this is not only your reality. There are a number of people, including John, who has shared some of his story about some of these kinds of devastating truths in his life. And so we, first of all, just want to acknowledge your pain. Secondly, I think even sending in the question for you to have taken the time, I think illustrates how much you care and that you're not being unrealistic to understand that if this person that you're longing to return would in fact return, that's not going to be the easiest thing. It's not going to be a simple thing. It's not going to be something that's going to flow very easily because, as you know, in relationship, we become more comfortable with the people around us, that we become familiar with their reactions and how they receive our words. But in this case, if there's been a time of absence, then for you to even be that considerate, even now, as you're potentially anticipating the return, to believe that that's going to be an awkward moment, I think it's incredibly wise of you. You express that maybe this will never happen in your lifetime. Well, I want to say to you, that may be true, but you see, God is involved. Who knows what He could make happen? And maybe it's not limited by your lifetime. Maybe it'll happen outside of your time here on earth. But at the end of the day, I would encourage you. Would you pray to Him that there would be a softening of hearts with the other party, and that you would remain poised to receive this person back into your life? And we will pray with you as we remember that this will actually occur, that this reconciliation could happen. But we must believe in this because His love does not run out. Does not run out. It's available in places where we can't even imagine, but it's available.
Thank you. You said, could the music stop? I have something to say. I believe that was in reference to the older son at the party.
I took some liberties with the story, I admit.
And there's no question, but it's a question. They didn't put a question mark in. Bob, it's not so easy to get over ourselves.
Yup.
How?
Go build a canoe for 33 days. I am serious. I am serious. Do you know and here's the invitation I would say. Like, for example, every once in a while there's an MDS trip that goes out, or there's a Sore Heartland that happens in spring, and you've been wondering like what this is about. I would encourage you to look at your world and decide, like to carve out some time, perhaps you've got some vacation days left, and decide to do something that takes you entirely out of the life that is so familiar to you. You will get over yourself. Like, it's the most interesting thing. I'll give you only one example. Hildy and I would, at the end of a long day, and let's say we'd been walking through acres of woods trying to collect spruce gum. If you do that, you're covered in the stuff. Everything about you is sticky. Everything is just uncomfortable. You can hardly wait to get back to get cleaned up and so on like that. But what happened is we would, at the end of a long day like that, we would come home and we almost didn't have the energy for a good conversation. It was like literally just survive, just shove some food in your mouth and get a good night's sleep because tomorrow's coming. We realized that we were so far from all the support mechanisms that the best gift we could offer to each other is to be good to each other in that moment. Because if we were at odds, if we got into an argument because of the stressful situation we were in, we would truly be alone. Because like, how do you then like not be in the same hotel room? One of us would have to go for a walk or something. So this idea of actually taking a risk to go into a place where you will reach your limits that you don't even know what they are, I think could shape you in profound ways. I hope that Hildy and I are never the same again. That's my hope.
Okay, we're pretty much out of time, but
Yeah.
I had to ask one of the
Please.
many questions about the canoe.
Yeah.
Where did you get the bear fat?
Okay, so Tom had a hunter friend. Please, John, I know you're in a hurry.
You can have the stage.
So Tom had a hunter friend who one day gave him some bear fat. When we asked about whether he still had contact with his hunter friend, Tom turned to us in his very dry humor and said, that was 14 years ago. So this fat, I will assure you, was rancid. So then when he added it to the spruce gum mixture, which was boiling in a cast iron pot over a fire, so we could heat it up, so we could apply it, and it was sort of the consistency of like thick maple syrup. And he added the fats. Then he gave us the instructions to put our thumbs in our mouths. And so when Hilda and I stood there like this, we really reached our limits. And then with your wet thumb, like when you're fixing the caulking around your bathtub at home, we would smear the stuff onto the seam, and then with our wet thumb, we would spread it. Well, what would happen once you're done with your first inch of application? Well, this thumb goes back in your mouth. And Tom would comment from the other end of the canoe, I'm not hearing enough slurping. You're not making your thumbs wet enough. Can you imagine my wife having to experience this? It was amazing. So, I do want to say, Hildy joined me on this adventure because she knew that this is something, of course, that would be something that would add so much to my life. And as you know, I'm a canoe enthusiast, and some of you have been asking, you're back now, are we going to hear some canoe stories? Yes, is the truth. So here you are. But I want to say, like, she's an extraordinary woman. She makes my life so good. And I'm inspired to be good to her in return. Yeah. She is, like, just by far the most extraordinary person I know. Her wisdom is astounding to me, the counsel that she provides, the insight that she gives, and to know how to encourage me at the end of the day to do this together. And sometimes we just held each other, literally, because that's all we had. And there she was, faithfully by my side. I am so blessed by her, so I thank Jesus for her. Thank you for your applause. That's the end of our Sunday together. Thank you for listening. I don't know what stirred in your heart. My hope is that you're willing to consider changes that are necessary for you and I to become more aligned with the heart of Jesus, with the heart of the Father. Jesus went as far as following his Father's wishes, and he went to the cross, and he died for our sins. He offers us this incredible life, and so surely to follow his example is incredibly intimidating, but the invitation stands for us to be about that. And so thank you for being part of this day. I do ask that you would just live your life and see your life perhaps through a little bit of a different lens. If you'd like to pray with someone, there's people at the front to pray with you. Be blessed. We'll see you next Sunday.